Hello and welcome to episode 172 of the Chills of Will podcast. It's a pleasure today to be joined by Robert Lopez. A little bit about Robert. He's the author of 3 novels, Part of the World, Kamby Bolongo Mean River, which is named one of 25 important books of the decade by HTML Giant, All Back Full, and 2 story collections, Asunder and Good People. A Better Class of People was published, that'll make it 3. If you want to include that as a short story collection, it is called A Novel in Stories. A Better Class of People was published by Dzanc Books in April of last year. Dispatches from Puerto Nowhere, which is his first nonfiction book, which will be the thrust of our conversation today, was published by $2 Radio on March 14th of this year, just a few days ago. His fiction, nonfiction, and poetry has appeared in dozens of publications, including Bomb, the Threepenny Review, Vice Magazine, New England Review, The Sun, and the Norton Anthology of Sudden Fiction, Latino. He teaches at Stony Brook University and has previously taught at Columbia University, the New School, Pratt Institute, and Syracuse University. He lives in Brooklyn, New York. Brooklyn, New York, but not Park Slope, right?
Yeah, not Park Slope. That's right.
You'll get that if you read the book. How are you today?
I'm okay, Peter. How are you?
Good, thanks. Pleasure to talk to you at any time, but especially just a few days after their publication. I was kind of asking before we started recording, but I know you're a veteran, but what's it like to have the book out in the world?
It's always a nice feeling to put a new book out in the world, to hold the physical object in your hand and know that all the work that you put into it and all the work that the publisher put into it can finally, reach some other people after, it being a very singular experience for so long, and it is gratifying, and I hope I don't mind talking about it, although it's not my best or favorite thing to do, but I do it. It's one of those close your eyes and think of England moments. I prefer, ideally, to just put the work out there and have it kind of other people talk or write about it, but I know that it's a good thing to do to share thoughts. So looking forward to this, and thank you for having me.
Of course. In the most recent book, in Dispatches from Puerto Nowhere, you talk about this is later in the book, but you talk about like you pretty much up until 22. Now maybe you're exaggerating, but maybe not. Up until 22 is pretty much just Elvis and Gretzky bios.
Yeah, I wasn't a reader growing up at all. I wasn't a good student as far as getting grades. I just didn't care. I was always curious about learning and curious about certain subject matter, whether it be history or mathematics or something along those lines. But I was never motivated to do well in school, and I didn't read books. I just wasn't something that interested me as a young person. My mother read, and she read kind of bestsellers and mysteries and those kind of books, but it never permeated down to me. And the only kind of reading that I may have done as a young person up until and through college were biographies of musicians and sports figures and things of that nature. But otherwise, books were none of my business until I graduated college and decided that writing was what I was going to do. And so I threw myself into reading as almost like a full-time occupation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what flipped the switch there? Was it one moment? Was it a series of moments?
Well, what flipped the switch was in my senior year as an undergrad, I studied television and film production sort of thing. And so we had our thesis was to produce a television show. And I always had it in the back of my head that I was a writer. I was going to be a writer, even though I hadn't written anything and I hadn't read anything. But somehow or another, I don't know. I thought maybe that this was something I was going to do in some fashion. And I volunteered to write the script. And when I wrote the script, it was, we cast professional actors in it, and it was quite a charge seeing these actors say my words. And so I
Mm.
thought, okay, here we are. I'm done with it. Graduated college in May. So this summer, I'm going to write a screenplay. But instead of writing a screenplay, I wound up cracking open my lit anthology from college that I didn't read when I took it in school. But I wound up reading all the stories and the poems in there. And instead of writing a screenplay, I wound up writing probably like 100 really bad poems and 2 really bad short stories. And I was hooked. And that's where it all began for me. I started going to libraries every week and bookstores. And I just, it became sort of a fever.
Mm. Well, I mean, it's really interesting in the book you talk about a lot about Long Island, and I feel like I know a lot about New York as a half Italian like yourself. I read a lot about, the mafia and
Sure.
not always the negative stories, but I know a lot about New York. I think a lot of people do. We feel like we do.
Mm.
But Long Island to me is I think Fran Drescher and the nanny maybe was there. And I guess a little bit from like The Great Gatsby, that kind of thing, but and you really describe it very well as a real conservative place, not necessarily like Christianity wise.
Right.
So I just kind of wonder about I mean, was there a dearth of culture in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, I've described it as a cultural wasteland. I mean, when I grew up and into my 20s, there just wasn't much, at least around the people I circulated with, my family, friends. There wasn't much talk or participation in anything cultural,
Hmm.
whether it be real music. I mean, there was some obviously music, right? There was hair bands and things of that nature. But no real cool. There's one little town on Long Island called Huntington, and there was a theater that played independent films, and there had some music venues that attracted really good artists or jazz and things of that nature. But it was so infrequently placed on Long Island, and Huntington was a pain to get to from where I grew up.
Hmm.
So it just wasn't easily accessible. And as a result of that, it just felt like a cultural wasteland.
Hmm.
And, most of the people I mixed with, I worked in restaurants on Long Island. And if you work in restaurants in New York City, most of your colleagues in the restaurants, particularly the wait staff and the bartenders, everybody's either an actor or a musician or a writer. Everybody's creative in some way. But on Long Island, that's not the case. The wait staff of all the restaurants, that none of them, it seems like, are creatives in that way, or artistic or artists. And as a result of that, it was a very kind of alienating place to be, because I did not have a deep connection with too many people at all. And yeah, so I don't recommend Long Island as a place to live. Although I have a few students out at Stony Brook who are quite exceptional and very, very talented and serious writers and artists. And so that is encouraging to me. So maybe in certain pockets and in certain places, it's changing.
Yeah. Well, so like when you did kind of your retroactive, when you did your retroactive reading and really maybe caught up on some things, I mean, it's so hackneyed to say understated or precise or efficient or kind of like Hemingway-esque, Carver-esque, but in this book I definitely saw a lot of understated that was so powerful. But I just kind of wonder maybe who you were inspired by, are inspired by, whether that was who you were reading back then or reading now or both.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned those two people, because I've said in other interviews in the past that I was reading all those poems, and I was really enamored with a lot of the classic college poems that you may have studied if you went to school in the late 80s or early 90s, like Auden and Gerald Manley Hopkins and A. Housman and a host of the canonical poets, Robert Frost, Wallace Stevens, and whatnot. So but when I read A Clean, Well-Lighted Place in that anthology that I mentioned by Ernest Hemingway, that made me want to write a story. That was the first story that made me want to write a story. And so I did. I wrote a couple of stories, and wasn't sure, what I was doing or what anything career like I might have had in mind. I certainly didn't know anything about that. But then reading Raymond Carver, finding his work, and in particular what we talk about when we talk about love, that collection of stories, that made me want to be a writer. That was my entry into, you know what, I think maybe this is something I could do too. So those two writers were springboards for me, and there have been a host since, and I could say that writers like Samuel Beckett, when I encountered Samuel Beckett in grad school, he changed the way I looked at narrative and language. David Markson with his books, Wittgenstein's Mistress and Reader's Block, that blew my head open as well. And there have been a host of writers over the years who have moved me to the desk and you know, pushed me to want to do this kind of crazy and sometimes futile endeavor.
Are you a fan of Hemingway's novels, or is it like short stories for you?
For you know what, it's interesting. I've never really tried any of his novels. I've cracked open, you know, The Sun Also, you know, Rises or Farewell to Arms, and nothing really grabbed me. I liked his stories better, but even, you know, there's a bunch of stories I like, and there's a bunch I just don't do anything for me as well. I mean, it's one of those things where you take what you can and you leave the rest, and that's how I feel about Hemingway.
That makes sense. I absolutely loved your. I gotta assume it's a. Oh man, I'm gonna say this word out loud. I don't know if I just say it correctly. The word is spelled Paean. Pain.
Oh yeah, a peon or payon.
Yeah, it is okay. Paeon,
yeah.
maybe.
Yeah.
A paeon to well-lighted place with the menudo, not a pues, not a pues.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Oh, I loved it.
did. You know, I've employed those sorts of things in a number of places throughout my writerly life, and I'm really glad you picked up on that, Pete, because
awesome.
It was put in there on purpose, and
Yeah.
I'm glad that you picked it up.
Oh, that was great. Of course, a great reference to Clean, Well-Lighted Place. As we get into, you know, to this book, you've obviously had a lot of great success with fiction, and this is your memoir. You know, I'm so interested when people have like multiple memoirs, you know.
Right,
Like,
yeah.
man, I would love to have a life that important, you know, or right.
No, I'm with you on that.
I feel like it's a one-time thing. So I wonder if it's a one-time thing for you, or what I mean is just like how self-flagellating was it? How, you know, how tough was it? Was it cathartic? Is that kind of like oversimplifying it? I mean, to really write about some really personal things.
Well, I never really set out to write a memoir. When I think of memoir, I think, you know, mostly somebody recounting the goings on of their life, where this happened and that happened and this happened and that happened. And so, you know, for me, this book started as the very first thing I wrote for it was an essay. It was a braided essay on the word spick and where it came from, and my experiences with that word growing up on Long Island, and both having it used at me as a pejorative, but also me and some of my friends using it as a sort of term of endearment. So that was what I started with the book, was just writing an essay on that. And the essay was what I like about essays, is that it was searching, it was an investigation, and it was a look not only within but without, right? So pointing the camera in both directions. And so for me with memoir, it seems that a lot of the camera pointing is inside, like this was my life. So for me, it was more of trying to investigate these issues and pointing the camera as much outside of myself as inside of myself. So I understand the publisher calling it a memoir, and I understand readers thinking of it as such. It certainly has a lot of memoiristic elements, but to me, it also does other things that memoir doesn't do, like including history about Puerto Rico and you know, there's a lot of sideways stuff in the book. So I never really decided to write a memoir, certainly not about myself, because I'm with you, like writers who write about themselves have more than one memoir, say. I find that a really interesting strategy as a writer. For me, the subject matter was interesting and universal enough that I could write about it and write about myself, all while looking at the world and at America in particular at the same time. So I enjoyed doing that. I don't, if I write another nonfiction book, which is possible, I've kicked around thoughts of doing the Italian side of my family and writing a kind of similar book on that, and maybe taking a look at, say, depictions of family life in Italians in media and film and television and such. But it was a good experience, and I enjoyed it tremendously. It exercised different muscles, but I can't say that I have plans to do another memoir.
Sure.
But I might well write another nonfiction book of some kind, perhaps.
Oh, okay. Well, so I mean, you talk about how it is, and I agree, it is universal in so many ways. Help me, I know she's a well-known author. Help me with the name. Is it Eula Biss?
That's correct, Eula Biss.
Yeah, so she has a great blurb amongst many great blurbs for the book, and it's, quote, "This book is an ode to what we don't know about ourselves," and the ourselves obviously includes you, but it's also everyone.
Right.
I mean, you define Puerto Nowhere as like everywhere. It's Canada to Chile, it's tropic, it's Arctic. There's no west-east boundaries. I wonder about Puerto Nowhere. I mean, is it what is it? Was that like the guiding kind of image for the book, or did that kind of come up later?
Yeah, that came up later, like so many things in the book came up later. But the idea of Puerto Nowhere is kind of wherever you are, wherever you find yourself. If you're disconnected from your past and your history and your family, you're kind of in a no man's land, no matter where you are. So the place that, obviously when people hear the word Puerto Rico, it's very rooted in the Caribbean, of course. And then there's the diaspora that is spread out across the United States mainly. So for me, the idea that no matter where I go, it's still Puerto Nowhere. Everywhere I go is a version of Puerto Nowhere. So I thought that was a relatively interesting way of framing the mindset and that space that one occupies when you really feel like you don't belong to where you probably should have belonged.
One of the quotes from the book is, quote, "Language is identity, it's history, it's everything." I mean, obviously you traffic in language. I wonder about, like, there are no easy answers in this book. There maybe are, but how you feel like writing about this was able to help you shed some light or not on ideas of erasure, assimilation, etc.
Well, it's funny because we just had the launch for the book in Brooklyn here at Greenlight Bookstore, and one of the questions was like, there are very few answers in the book, and the question was, how do you feel about that sort of thing? And it's like it's really grappling with the question and grappling with the reality of assimilation and this erasure, and saying, okay, this is what happened. This is its effect on me. This is maybe why it happened. This is the end result, what was accomplished, and examining it from as many angles as possible without trying to come to any hard conclusion about it.
Yeah.
I think obviously erasing one's culture is a bad idea. One shouldn't do it. But I also think it's understandable given certain contextual realities. And yeah, for me, the questions are always more interesting than the answers. And that's why I played around with the questions over and over again in the book, and I think there are very few answers in the book.
Yeah, and I mean, it wouldn't have made sense, right? In the context of the book, in the context of what you talk about, there are no easy answers. It's not like it's the end period, we're done. No, I mean, it's It's an ongoing questions, right?
It is an ongoing question, and I suppose that there are people out in the world who try to reclaim a heritage in a way and say, "Oh, I've had some sort of awakening, and I feel more connected to my ethnicity or my race or my religion or whatever." But that's not, if I tried to present any of the information that way or any of the narrative that way or myself as that way, it would be fraudulent, because for me, I don't feel a connection to it, and I still don't. This book didn't magically make me feel like I have more of a connection to Puerto Rico or Puerto Rican people or my family. It wasn't in any way like cathartic or healing, or it didn't do any of that work for me. It just examined the questions and the whys and the wherefores and looks at that void in hopefully as honest a fashion as I was able to do it.
Definitely. I wonder, you're talking about like publishing and, given the name memoir, maybe it's not quite a memoir, but like, I mean, I don't know if they try to present it, whether it's the publishers or just yourself or writers, like publish, who like might be your literary analog? I thought a lot of like Sigrid Nunez.
Yeah. I actually,
friend.
I shouldn't admit to this, but I've never read Sigrid Nunez. I mean, I'm curious about a couple of books.
Yeah.
But
I've only
I
read the
haven't
one.
gotten around to Sigrid. What's that?
I've only read the one, which is The Friend, which is a great book, and it's more, but it's just like the fact in non sequiturs is not the word for the book, but for your book, but the style of it, right? Where it's, they're obviously they're dispatches. I don't know how many different little chapters or dispatch. I'm gonna ask you about that word in just a minute, but like, she really has a lot of profundity, like in almostly what are seemingly disconnected sentences, right? I mean, a lot of your dispatches are one sentence paragraphs, right? And so that was just one of the things I was thinking about. Would you say that there are writers similar to you, or vice versa, or was that not, just like, hey, if it happens to be, it was an accident, like you weren't going for that?
Well, I mean, yeah, I like to think that the book is in conversation with a host of other books, and there are writers who I really appreciate the work that they do. So when I started writing this book, I looked at a lot of nonfiction to get a sense of what writers were doing, and I looked at writers like Vivian Gornick and who didn't really do anything that I could rip off in such a easy way, but certainly people like Maggie Nelson and Eula Biss and John DeGata, Andrew Monson. I mean, there are a host of writers who look at subject matter kind of askew and try to examine issues that go beyond oneself in the world and one's own soap operas, if you will. So yeah, there are a lot of nonfiction books that I did read and appreciate, and I've always liked working in distilled bursts, those fragments and fractured. I've taught a lot of fractured narrative, both in fiction and nonfiction, and it's a mode that I really appreciate and feel comfortable working with.
Yeah, how did you so successfully do what you call it, fractured narrative?
Yeah,
I mean, how do you feel like you did that so successfully? Like, I mean, it, in the hands of a lesser writer, it could obviously go astray. It could be completely seemingly unrelated, and I mean, do you feel like there were, like, did you write it chronologically? I mean, not that, like, there's the way the book appeared, is that the way you wrote it, or was it this dispatch and I come back to this one?
Well, so originally the book started as a collection of braided essays. So the essays themselves were fractured and fragmented.
Okay, right.
But they were a series of essays that had beginnings and ends. And talking with Eric of $2 Radio, he offered early in the process, after we agreed to do the book together, he said, "What if this is one book-length essay?" And I said, "Ooh, that's a really cool idea. Let me see if I can play around with it." And I wound up kind of blowing up the essays and seeing how the threads in the separate essays could connect to each other, and how I could spread them out over time, and turn it into very short chapters or vignettes, if you will, that became the dispatches over time. So it wasn't something that happened initially. That the final form of the book took a solid, after we agreed to do the book together, we signed the contract. It took a full year of working on the book to arrive at the final form. So it was an evolution that occurred over the course of a full year with the publisher. And before that, it was a series of braided essays that was fragmented in nature, but each essay had a beginning and end. And so instead of that happening, there are no more ends of those essays. They got spread out over the course of the whole book.
Oh, okay. Well, so, you know, since they are dispatches, I want, you know, to me that kind of has like the connotation of like, you know, I don't know, talking about Hemingway or something like that. He's in Spain for like the Spanish Civil Wars, you know, kind of like journalistic, kind of like dispassionate, but the subject in many ways it is you, not like he says, not wholly you, wholly with the W. Right. But so what was that like to be dispassionate, but also with you as one of, if not the main character?
You know, obviously this is the first nonfiction thing I've done. And so writing about myself and what I actually think or what I actually went through, what I actually saw was a different experience for me. And putting my name in the book and referring to myself like that was a new experience. But I have to say, you know, somebody asked, you know, it's so personal, you know, what do you think about that? It doesn't bother me at all. I mean, I don't mind putting this out there into the world, and but at the same time, I also think it is a performance. And even though everything I say in the book is what I think or believe at a particular time, it also evolves. And so if I've evolved as a writer and as a person, you know, if I tried to rewrite this book in 5 years or tried to write this book 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I think it would be much different. And so that to me is also one of the interesting elements of this endeavor.
A couple of really interesting lines. The first is literally the opening line of the book is, quote, "What I don't know about my family is almost everything." Writing about how, you know, on your dad's side of the family, Puerto Rico, Spain, Cuba, you know, it focuses on your grandfather, Sixto.
Yep.
Right. And, you know, coming from Puerto Rico, and then, you know, it would have been what, your maternal grandmother's side from Spain, from Cuba, and just basically saying everything was erased. You, I'm probably going to butcher the Czech writer. Is it Miloš?
Yeah. Czesław Miloš.
So the actual quote was, "When a writer is born into a family, the family is finished." And you write about, you like the misquote better.
Yeah.
Right? So I wonder about how that quote, which is some of the effect of, "When a writer is born into a family, it's the end of the family."
Right.
And in both of those, I read them as negatives. But you kind of like said, well, maybe there's a positive there. Maybe I'm oversimplifying, but this idea of like the family has like achieved something. The family has, you know, met its goal. So I wonder about how that quote kind of informed this book.
Well, you know, that, you know, as far as that's a joke, right? That, you know, we birthed a writer, so, you know, there's no need to go on. You did everything you could do as a family line. That's just a pure joke, of course. But the line was something that I appreciated when I first heard it, and it really, to me, is vital for a writer to, you know, the word fearless gets thrown around in a lot of different arenas. And of course, nobody is, very few people are truly fearless. You have to feel the fear, but just do it anyway. And I think as artists, as writers, if you're not risking that sort of emotional danger, if you're not risking everything on the page, then you're really compromising some essential element of the work.
Mm.
So that quote to me was really important to give license to real freedom and authority to say whatever you need to say in service of the narrative or the truth of a piece, to get it right, because that's the only job of a writer, is to get it as close to perfect and as close to true as you can.
Mm.
And if you're risking some sort of familial relationship or estrangement, then I think that's, the choice you have to make. I think there's a way to be an artist, and that is to, in some ways, maybe be reckless, but at the same time, respecting people and trying to do right by whoever you feel like you have to do right by.